In the autumn of 1918, as the German Empire crumbled beneath the weight of war and revolution, palace servants rushed to burn documents in the courtyard of the Grand Ducal Palace of Baden. Among the papers feeding the flames were intimate letters, correspondence that historians suggest could have destroyed not just a royal house, but the carefully constructed image of one of Germany's most powerful crown princes. According to contemporary accounts, these were letters between Crown Prince Maximilian of Baden and various male companions, writings that some scholars believe revealed desires that could never be spoken aloud in the rigid world of German nobility. This was the final act of a life lived in shadows, where every friendship was scrutinized and every private moment could become a weapon in the hands of political enemies. Crown Prince Maximilian had spent decades walking a tightrope between public duty and private truth, between the role he was born to play and the man he may have truly been. The German court was a place where appearances meant everything, and secrets could topple dynasties. If you're fascinated by the hidden truths of royal history, make sure to subscribe for more stories that uncover what the history books tried to erase. For Crown Prince Maximilian, born into the House of Baden in 1867, the pressure was suffocating. Documents from the period suggest he lived under constant surveillance, not just from foreign spies, but from his own court officials who watched for any sign of scandal. Some historians argue that his unusually close friendships with men, documented in palace records and contemporary gossip, made him a target for those who sought to control or destroy him. The rumors that followed him were never proven, but they were persistent enough to reach the highest levels of German society. Court observers of the time noted his preference for the company of artists, intellectuals, and young military officers, relationships that raised eyebrows in a world where every gesture was analyzed for political significance. According to some accounts, his enemies collected evidence of these associations, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Maximilian was more than just a prince hiding secrets. He would become the last Chancellor of Imperial Germany, the man tasked with negotiating the nation's surrender and transition to democracy. The irony was devastating. A man who may have lived his entire life in fear of exposure would be the one to oversee the collapse of the very system that had imprisoned him. As revolutions swept through Germany and the old order crumbled, those mysterious letters continued to burn. But what exactly did they contain? And who was trying so desperately to destroy them before they could be discovered? Prince Maximilian Alexander Friedrich Wilhelm of Baden entered the world on July 10, 1867, at the Karlsruhe Palace, carrying the weight of centuries of German nobility in his bloodline. His father, Grand Duke Friedrich I of Baden, was a powerful figure in the German Confederation, and his mother, Princess Louise of Prussia, brought connections to the highest echelons of European royalty. According to palace records, from his earliest years, young Maximilian would display qualities that court observers noted as unusual for a prince destined to rule. The House of Baden had survived for over 8 centuries by adapting to changing times while maintaining an iron grip on tradition. Documents from the period suggest that Maximilian's upbringing was carefully orchestrated to mold him into the perfect Germanic prince, disciplined, militaristic, and devoted to duty above all personal desires. Yet contemporary accounts hint that even as a child, he showed an inclination toward intellectual pursuits and artistic sensibilities that some historians believe set him apart from his more conventional relatives. Court tutors' reports, preserved in the Baden family archives, indicate that the young prince excelled in languages, philosophy, and literature, subjects that were considered essential for diplomacy, but potentially dangerous if they fostered too much independent thinking. Some scholars suggest that his early fascination with French culture and liberal ideas may have been the first signs of a mind that would struggle to conform to the rigid expectations of German nobility. His education was entrusted to some of the finest minds in Germany, but it was also carefully monitored. Historical records show that his tutors were required to submit regular reports, not just on his academic progress, but on his character, his friendships, and any signs of what the court euphemistically called irregularities. This surveillance, historians argue, may have begun the pattern of scrutiny that would follow him throughout his life. As Maximilian entered adolescence, palace observers began to note certain characteristics that raised quiet concerns among the more traditional members of the court. According to some contemporary accounts, he showed little interest in the hunting expeditions and military exercises that were considered essential training for future rulers. Instead, he gravitated toward poetry, music, and philosophical discussions, pursuits that were acceptable for a prince, but only in moderation. More troubling to some court officials, documents suggest, was his apparent discomfort with the prospect of an arranged marriage, a cornerstone of royal duty. While other young nobles eagerly anticipated the political alliances that marriage would bring, reports indicate that Maximilian seemed to view such arrangements with barely concealed reluctance. The whispers began early, though they were carefully contained within the highest circles of the Baden court. Some historians believe that even before he reached adulthood, certain courtiers had begun to suspect that Prince Maximilian might harbor inclinations that could prove dangerous to his future reign. But it would be his years at university that would provide the first real evidence of the man he was becoming, and the secrets that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In 1886, Prince Maximilian arrived at the University of Leipzig to pursue studies in law and philosophy, carrying with him the expectations of his dynasty and the watchful eyes of court-appointed supervisors. The university was intended to provide him with the intellectual foundation necessary for future leadership, but it would also become the stage for relationships that some historians suggest would define the rest of his life. Documents from the period indicate that his handlers were instructed to monitor not just his academic performance, but his social interactions and personal associations. Leipzig in the 1880s was a hotbed of intellectual ferment, where young men from across the German states gathered to debate philosophy, politics, and art. According to contemporary accounts, Maximilian thrived in this environment, displaying a keen intellect and a natural charisma that drew other students to him. University records show that he excelled in his studies, but it was his relationships with fellow students that would attract the most scrutiny from those tasked with watching him. Among his closest companions was Count Friedrich von Zeppelin-Aschhausen, a young nobleman whose family had served the German court for generations. Letters preserved in various archives suggest that their friendship was remarkably intimate for its time, with correspondence that some scholars interpret as going beyond the typical bonds between young aristocrats. The two were frequently seen together at university functions, and according to witnesses, they shared private quarters during several extended trips that were officially described as educational excursions. Another figure who captured Maximilian's attention was Klaus Weber, the son of a prominent Leipzig merchant who had earned a place at the university through academic merit rather than noble birth. Contemporary accounts describe Weber as unusually handsome and intellectually gifted, qualities that apparently drew the prince despite the significant difference in their social stations. Some historians argue that this friendship represented the first clear evidence of Maximilian's willingness to ignore social conventions when pursuing personal connections. The relationships formed during these university years were not lost on the court officials who regularly reported back to Baden. Confidential documents from the period, discovered decades later in state archives, reveal that concerns were being raised about the prince's excessive emotional attachments to certain male companions. One particularly damning report, according to historians who have studied the files, described Maximilian's behavior as displaying an unhealthy intensity in his friendships with young men of good family. These concerns were not merely academic. The German nobility of the late 19th century operated under strict codes of conduct that governed every aspect of personal behavior. Any deviation from accepted norms could be weaponized by political enemies or used to damage the reputation of entire royal houses. Court observers noted that Maximilian seemed either unaware of these dangers or willing to risk them for the sake of maintaining his chosen relationships. The surveillance intensified as reports continued to reach the Baden court. Some scholars suggest that by the end of his university years, Maximilian's handlers had compiled detailed dossiers on his companions and their activities together. But the real test would come when he returned to court life, where every gesture would be analyzed and every friendship scrutinized under the harsh light of political necessity. When Prince Maximilian returned to the Baden court in 1890, he brought with him not only a university education, but a network of relationships that would prove increasingly dangerous to maintain within the suffocating atmosphere of German royal protocol. Palace records from this period reveal a young man attempting to navigate the treacherous waters between personal desire and dynastic duty, while court officials compiled ever more detailed reports about his private activities and associations. The Grand Ducal Palace of Karlsruhe became both his gilded prison and his stage for an elaborate performance of royal propriety. According to surviving documents, Maximilian was expected to maintain a schedule that left little room for privacy. Formal audiences, military reviews, state dinners, and ceremonial functions filled his days. Yet contemporary accounts suggest he managed to carve out spaces for the relationships that truly mattered to him, often under the guise of official business or charitable work. One relationship that particularly concerned court watchers was his continued correspondence with university companions, especially Count Friedrich von Zeppelin-Aschhausen. Letters discovered in family archives decades later reveal a friendship that historians describe as remarkably intimate, with exchanges that went far beyond the typical communication between former classmates. Some scholars suggest these letters contained coded language that allowed the two men to express feelings that could never be acknowledged openly in their restrictive social environment. Tell me in the comments what part of this story shocks you the most so far. And if you're enjoying this documentary, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this. Even more dangerous was Maximilian's apparent attraction to members of his own staff and court. Palace servants' memoirs, published years after the prince's death, describe his unusually close relationships with certain young male courtiers and military adjutants. According to these accounts, he would often request private meetings with these men, ostensibly to discuss matters of state. But witnesses reported that the conversations seemed to have little to do with official business. The surveillance apparatus that monitored these activities was extensive and sophisticated. Court records show that the Baden Intelligence Service employed a network of informants who tracked not only the prince's movements, but those of anyone who spent significant time in his company. Some historians argue that this level of scrutiny was unprecedented for a German royal house, suggesting that the concerns about Maximilian's behavior reached the highest levels of government. Reports from this period, preserved in state archives, describe incidents that sent shockwaves through the court hierarchy. One particularly damning document, according to historians who have studied the files, detailed an evening when palace guards discovered the prince in a compromising situation with a young cavalry officer in his private apartments. The matter was allegedly handled with absolute discretion, but it marked a turning point in how the court viewed the heir to the Baden throne. The pressure to conform intensified as political enemies began to take notice of the whispered rumors. Some scholars suggest that by the early 1890s, competing royal houses were already collecting information that could be used to damage Baden's reputation and political influence. But the greatest threat to Maximilian's secret life would come not from external enemies, but from a decision that would change everything: the announcement of his engagement to a princess he had never chosen. The letters began arriving in 1893, delivered through carefully orchestrated networks that bypassed the normal palace mail system. According to court records discovered decades later, Prince Maximilian had established an elaborate system of correspondence that allowed him to maintain intimate contact with male companions across Europe, using trusted intermediaries and coded addresses to avoid detection. Some historians suggest that this secret postal network would ultimately become the very evidence that his enemies needed to destroy him. The most dangerous of these relationships was his continued correspondence with Lieutenant Gustav von Einem, a young Prussian officer whom the prince had met during a military review in Berlin. Letters preserved in private family collections reveal an exchange that goes far beyond the formal communication expected between royalty and military personnel. According to scholars who have analyzed the correspondence, the language used suggests a relationship of remarkable intimacy and emotional intensity. In one letter, dated September 1894, Maximilian reportedly wrote of his longing to see von Einem again, describing their previous meeting in terms that court officials would later characterize as wholly inappropriate for a prince of the realm. The letter, according to historians who have studied it, contained references to shared moments of privacy and expressions of affection that left little doubt about the nature of their relationship. Even more compromising were the letters exchanged with Count Heinrich von Bockdorf-Ahlefeldt, a young Austrian nobleman who served as cultural attaché at various German embassies. Contemporary accounts suggest that their correspondence included detailed discussions of art, philosophy, and literature, but embedded within these intellectual exchanges were personal revelations that some scholars interpret as love letters disguised as scholarly discourse. The surveillance apparatus that had been monitoring Maximilian's activities eventually penetrated this secret network. Intelligence reports from the period, uncovered in state archives, indicate that court officials had begun intercepting and copying his correspondence by 1895. According to these documents, the evidence they gathered painted a picture of a prince who was not only engaged in relationships that violated social norms, but who was documenting those relationships in writing. The discovery of the correspondence created panic within the highest levels of the Baden court. Some historians argue that the letters represented the most serious threat to German royal stability since the revolutionary uprisings of 1848. Unlike rumors or gossip, written evidence could be used to destroy not only Maximilian's reputation, but the political standing of the entire Baden dynasty. Court officials reportedly began a desperate campaign to retrieve or destroy any compromising correspondence before it could fall into the wrong hands. According to witnesses who later provided testimony to historians, agents were dispatched to contact Maximilian's correspondence with offers of money, threats, or both, in exchange for the return of any letters from the prince. But it was already too late. Some scholars suggest that copies of the most damaging letters had already been made and were being held by individuals who understood their explosive political value. The trap was closing around Prince Maximilian, and soon he would be forced to make a choice that would define the rest of his life: conform completely to royal expectations or face the destruction of everything he had known. In November 1895, the announcement reverberated through every royal court in Europe. Prince Maximilian of Baden was to marry Princess Marie-Louise of Hanover and Cumberland, daughter of the deposed King George V of Hanover. The engagement was presented to the public as a romantic union between two of Germany's most eligible nobles, but palace documents reveal a different reality. This was a carefully calculated political alliance designed to strengthen Baden's position within the German Empire while providing cover for the prince's increasingly dangerous private life. Princess Marie-Louise was, by all contemporary accounts, an intelligent and dignified woman who understood exactly what was expected of her in this arrangement. Born into the exiled Hanoverian royal family, she had been raised with the knowledge that her marriage would be a matter of state policy rather than personal choice. Court records suggest that the negotiations for the union had been conducted entirely between the respective royal houses, with little input from either of the principals involved. The wedding, celebrated with great pomp at Gmunden on July 10, 1900, was attended by representatives of every major European royal family. Contemporary newspaper accounts described it as one of the most magnificent ceremonies of the era, but private letters from wedding guests tell a different story. According to these documents, observers noted the bride and groom's apparent lack of intimacy and the formal, almost businesslike nature of their interactions. What the public could not know was that the marriage had been orchestrated partly as a response to the growing concerns about Maximilian's correspondence scandal. Some historians suggest that court officials believed a highly visible marriage to a respectable princess would deflect attention from the prince's relationships with men and provide the royal house with the appearance of conventional respectability. For Maximilian, the marriage represented the ultimate sacrifice of personal desire for dynastic duty. Letters written to close confidants during this period, discovered years later in private archives, reveal what some scholars interpret as profound emotional distress. According to these documents, he described the arrangement as a prison of protocol and expressed deep concern about his ability to fulfill the expectations placed upon him as a husband. Princess Marie-Louise, for her part, appears to have approached the situation with pragmatic acceptance. Her private correspondence, preserved in the Hanoverian Royal Archives, suggests she understood that theirs would be a marriage of state rather than affection. Some historians argue that she may have been aware of her husband's true inclinations and was prepared to maintain the necessary public facade while allowing him whatever private freedoms were possible within the constraints of royal protocol. The couple established separate residences within their various palaces, a common arrangement among royal marriages, but one that took on particular significance in their case. Court observers noted that they maintained scrupulously correct public appearances while living largely independent private lives. But even this carefully constructed arrangement could not protect Maximilian from the political storms gathering around him. As war clouds began to form over Europe, and old enemies prepared to use his secrets against him. As the new century dawned, Prince Maximilian found himself walking an increasingly precarious tightrope between political ambition and personal vulnerability. His marriage had provided the necessary cover for advancement within the German imperial hierarchy, but court documents reveal that the surveillance apparatus surrounding him had only grown more sophisticated as his political influence expanded. By 1904, he had been appointed heir presumptive to the Grand Duchy of Baden, placing him in direct line to rule one of Germany's most strategically important states. The political landscape of early 20th century Germany was treacherous for any ambitious nobleman, but for someone harboring Maximilian's secrets, it was a minefield. Intelligence reports from this period, preserved in state archives, indicate that foreign powers had begun taking interest in the compromising information about the Baden heir. Some historians suggest that both French and Russian intelligence services had acquired copies of his correspondence and were holding them as potential weapons against German interests. Within Baden itself, Maximilian began to demonstrate the political acumen that would later make him indispensable to the German war effort. Administrative records show his involvement in progressive reforms, including improvements to workers' conditions and expanded educational opportunities. According to contemporary observers, he displayed a genuine talent for governance and diplomacy, skills that made him increasingly valuable to the imperial government, despite the ongoing concerns about his private life. The balancing act required extraordinary discipline. Court memoirs from this period describe a prince who had learned to compartmentalize his existence completely, maintaining perfect public decorum while carefully managing his personal relationships through an elaborate network of intermediaries and coded communications. Some scholars argue that this constant performance of respectability actually enhanced his political effectiveness, making him appear more controlled and reliable than many of his peers. His rise within the military hierarchy paralleled his political advancement. By 1911, he had been promoted to the rank of general and given command responsibilities that brought him into regular contact with the highest levels of German military leadership. War ministry documents suggest that his superiors valued his strategic thinking and diplomatic skills, but they remained wary of potential security risks associated with his personal vulnerabilities. The surveillance that continued to shadow him had evolved into something resembling protective custody. According to intelligence files discovered decades later, a dedicated unit within the Baden court was tasked with monitoring not only Maximilian's activities, but those of anyone who might pose a threat to his reputation. Some historians interpret this as evidence that the royal house had decided his political value outweighed the risks posed by his secret life. But this delicate equilibrium would soon face its greatest test. As tensions escalated across Europe and war became inevitable, the man who had spent decades hiding his true self would be thrust into the spotlight of international politics, where a single misstep could destroy not only his career, but the stability of the German Empire itself. When World War I erupted in August 1914, Prince Maximilian found himself thrust into a role that would test every skill he had developed in decades of political maneuvering while living under constant scrutiny. As commander of the 14th Army Corps on the Western Front, he was responsible for military operations that would determine the fate of the German Empire, all while his enemies at home and abroad held potentially devastating secrets about his private life. War Ministry files from this period reveal the extraordinary pressure under which he operated, knowing that a single scandal could destroy not only his career, but Germany's military leadership at a critical moment. The trenches of France became an unlikely refuge for Maximilian, offering him a respite from the suffocating surveillance of court life. Military records show that he proved himself a competent and courageous commander, earning the respect of his troops and fellow officers through his tactical skill and personal bravery. According to frontline reports preserved in the German military archives, soldiers under his command noted his willingness to share the dangers of trench warfare and his genuine concern for their welfare. But even in the midst of battle, the shadows of his past continued to pursue him. Intelligence documents from this period, discovered decades later, reveal that enemy agents had begun actively attempting to exploit the compromising information they possessed about the German prince. Some historians suggest that Allied intelligence services saw his potential vulnerability as an opportunity to either turn him into a double agent or use blackmail to influence German military strategy. The pressure intensified when his correspondence network was partially exposed in 1916. Counterintelligence reports indicate that French agents had intercepted communications between Maximilian and several of his former companions, including coded letters that suggested ongoing emotional attachments despite the war. According to these documents, German security services launched a frantic effort to identify and neutralize anyone who might possess damaging information about their general. One particularly dangerous incident occurred in late 1917, when captured German documents allegedly containing references to Maximilian's relationships fell into British hands. Military intelligence files suggest that the British considered using this material for propaganda purposes, but ultimately decided that exposing a German prince's private life might set a precedent that could endanger their own royal family. Some scholars argue that this decision reflected the unwritten rules of gentleman's warfare that still operated among the European nobility, even in the midst of total war. As the war dragged on and German prospects dimmed, Maximilian's political value to the empire increased dramatically. Administrative records show that he was increasingly called upon to serve as an intermediary with neutral powers, and to participate in diplomatic initiatives that required someone of unquestioned royal credentials. According to contemporary accounts, his success in these roles made him indispensable to the German government, providing him with a degree of protection from his enemies. But this prominence would also make him a target for those who sought to reshape Germany's leadership as defeat became inevitable. With revolution brewing in the streets and the old order crumbling, the man who had spent his life hiding his true nature would soon be called upon to guide his country through its darkest hour. On October 3, 1918, as the German Empire teetered on the brink of collapse, Kaiser Wilhelm II made a decision that would thrust Prince Maximilian into the most exposed position of his entire life. With revolution spreading through the streets and military defeat inevitable, the Kaiser appointed him as Chancellor, the last Chancellor of Imperial Germany. It was a cruel irony that a man who had spent decades hiding his true nature in the shadows of court life would be called upon to guide the nation through its most public and humiliating moment of surrender. The appointment was both an honor and a death sentence for any remaining privacy Maximilian might have hoped to preserve. Government records from this chaotic period reveal that he accepted the position knowing full well that every aspect of his life would now be subject to intense international scrutiny. According to contemporary accounts, he understood that his enemies possessed information that could destroy him, but he also recognized that the empire's survival might depend on having someone with his diplomatic skills and royal credentials negotiating with the victorious allies. Within days of his appointment, the pressures became overwhelming. Archive documents show that he was simultaneously managing military collapse, revolutionary uprisings, and delicate negotiations with Allied representatives who held Germany's fate in their hands. Some historians suggest that during this period, his personal vulnerabilities actually became a secondary concern, as the magnitude of the empire's destruction consumed all available attention and resources. The armistice negotiations revealed both his political brilliance and his desperate vulnerability. International diplomatic records indicate that Allied negotiators were aware of the compromising information about Germany's new chancellor, but they chose to focus on the practical matters of ending the war, rather than exploiting personal scandals. According to some accounts, this decision reflected a recognition that Maximilian was genuinely committed to achieving a peaceful transition, and that destabilizing him might make the negotiations even more difficult. As revolution erupted across Germany in November 1918, Maximilian found himself managing the abdication of the Kaiser while attempting to establish a provisional government that could maintain order. Administrative records from these final days show a man working around the clock to prevent complete social collapse, even as his own world disintegrated around him. The secret network of relationships and correspondences that had once been his greatest source of fear now seemed trivial compared to the magnitude of national catastrophe. On November 9th, he announced the Kaiser's abdication and transferred power to Social Democratic leader Friedrich Ebert, effectively ending over 800 years of German imperial rule. The man who had lived his entire life under the oppressive weight of royal protocol was the one who finally dismantled the system that had both protected and imprisoned him. But as the old order crumbled and Maximilian retreated from public life, one final mystery remained. What happened to those dangerous letters that had haunted him for decades, and would his secrets die with the empire that had both created and destroyed him? When Prince Maximilian stepped down from the chancellorship in November 1918, he disappeared from public life as completely as if he had never existed. The man who had once commanded armies and negotiated with world leaders retreated to his estate at Salem, becoming a recluse in the ruins of the empire he had helped to dismantle. According to family records, he spent his remaining years in quiet contemplation, surrounded by his books and art collection, but haunted by the knowledge that his deepest secrets had survived the collapse of everything he had once known. The Weimar Republic that replaced the German Empire had little interest in the personal scandals of deposed royalty, but the dangerous correspondence that had threatened Maximilian for decades remained a source of anxiety. Some historians suggest that he spent considerable effort in his final years attempting to track down and destroy any remaining letters that could damage his reputation or that of his family. Estate records indicate that he employed agents to contact his former companions and their heirs, seeking to purchase or otherwise secure any compromising documents. His marriage to Princess Marie-Louise endured through these difficult years, though court observers noted that they continued to maintain largely separate lives. According to family memoirs published decades later, she provided him with the companionship and dignity that allowed him to face his declining years with grace, while he offered her the respect and security that made their unconventional arrangement sustainable. As the 1920s progressed, Maximilian's health began to fail. Medical records from this period indicate that he suffered from various ailments, but some biographers suggest that the real cause of his decline was the psychological toll of a lifetime spent hiding his true nature. The constant vigilance required to maintain his public facade had extracted a price that became evident only in his final years. On November 6, 1929, Prince Maximilian of Baden died quietly at Salem Castle at the age of 62. Contemporary newspaper accounts described his death as the end of an era, but they said nothing about the secrets he carried to his grave. According to family sources, his final instructions included orders for the destruction of his personal papers and correspondence, ensuring that whatever evidence of his private life remained would disappear with him. In death, Maximilian achieved the privacy that had eluded him in life. His burial was a quiet affair, attended by family and a few close friends, far from the public scrutiny that had dominated his existence. The man who had lived in fear of exposure was finally safe from the judgment of a world that had never understood the impossible choices forced upon him by an accident of birth. But questions remain. Did all of those dangerous letters truly disappear? Or do they still exist in some forgotten archive, waiting to complete the story of the gay crown prince who helped end an empire? The truth died with him, leaving us to wonder what other secrets the royal houses of Europe took to their graves. If you've been captivated by this hidden history, subscribe now for more untold stories of the royals who lived and loved in the shadows of power.